What do Nazi war criminals, New York City parking meters, and asphalt manufacturers have in common? Each featured in a major government scandal or abuse of taxpayer money in post-war America. The ex-Nazis were living and working openly in the U.S. for decades after World War II. In New York, parking authorities were dunning motorists to the tune of $20 million a year in questionable fines, with kickbacks to local politicians. And during the 1970s, asphalt companies made millions from charging inflated prices to agencies like the Port Authority. These cases didn't come to light by accident. They had something else in common. Each was uncovered by extraordinary individuals who refused to accept business as usual. It's not hard to see why we call them watchdogs. A stubborn congresswoman from New York, Liz Holtzman, sniffed out the Nazis during an 8-year investigation. The parking overcharges were brought to light by a lone legislator. A special government oversight committee brought the asphalt cartel to justice. You can probably add examples of your own from the daily headlines. They all bring home a simple truth. Without such watchdogs, our democracy would be a lot poorer. But what makes a watchdog bark? Daniel Feldman, an associate professor at John Jay, has written a remarkable book about the subject. It's called The Art of the Watchdog. Co-authored by David Eichenthal, a fellow at NYU School of Law, the book's meaty subtitle tells it all: Fighting Fraud, Waste, Abuse, and Corruption in Government. Few are better qualified to tell the story than Dan. He was a legislator who uncovered the parking extortion. And with over 30 years' experience in rooting out corruption, including service as a New York State Assemblyman and a stint as a special counsel to former New York Attorney General Eliot Spitzer, he's what you might call one of America's watchdog elite. He's with us today on Criminal Justice Matters. Dan, welcome to the program. Let's start with a simple question. Why the art of the watchdog and not science of the watchdog?
Well, because some of it's, I mean, a lot of it's intuitive. It's not always formulaic. To extend the metaphor, you need a nose. I mean, it's
you need a nose,
right?
Like
I mean, dogs, of course, have really great noses. I don't know, but a government watchdog needs a good nose too. Just a sense of what looks right, what looks bad.
So we're talking here about government officials. We're not talking about the whistleblowers, the folks who, the ordinary citizen who finds something wrong.
Well,
the watchdog is the person who gets the information.
Yes, although whistleblowers play a crucial role in government oversight as well. I mean, I can, a number of my own investigations, for example, depended heavily on people of conscience inside agencies who were getting nowhere, complaining of wrongdoing, and came to us in confidence, and we were able to act on what they said, expose the things that they talked about. First verify, but then expose.
But when we talk about an oversight professional, right, which is kind of an interesting phrase, who are we basically talking about?
Well, it's not just government people. Of course, since the 1970s, the term inspector general has become kind of the dominant nomenclature. But it's not only IGs, it's inspector general. I would consider a good investigative journalist to be an important government watchdog if they cover government. There are private sector people who do this. There's actually something called an IPSIG, an independent private sector inspector general. There are other investigative groups in the private sector that do this kind of work. Actually, even what we call, I use a little Latin for qui tam, it's a phrase meaning, this talks about lawyers who represent people who sue fraud artists who are defrauding government, and if they win, they actually get a percentage. The private citizen who brings the suit gets a percentage of the savings to government,
right.
And this has brought in literally billions of dollars in money brought back to government in the past decade or so.
I find it extraordinary that when we think about a watchdog, I mean, in democracy, we're actually hiring the folks who are looking after us, whereas in a lot of other countries, the idea would be a mystical experience. That's a good start, isn't it? That we actually are hiring these folks, and in all sections of government, local, state, federal, right?
Yes, but it's by no means universal. I mean, it's still true that only a minority of local jurisdictions have IGs. Not even all states have them. And the federal IGs there were very few federal IGs until legislation in the early 1970s that really established the current program, which now covers virtually every federal agency. So, and although, as I say, some localities have IGs, it's not only not universal, it's not even majority.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there was a time when corruption fighting, when watchdogs were all over the press, made every headline, from Watergate, Abscam. But lately, we haven't heard a lot about them. We've heard the latest one, Bridgegate.
Oh.
But I mean, have they gone down in public interest, public assessment? Have we changed?
Well, what has gone down is print investigative journalism. Newspapers themselves, as you know,
very well,
have been walloped. There are fewer than there were. By the way, I should correct it. If I may have given a slight misimpression. I mean, we had wonderful watchdogs in the 19th century. People like Upton Sinclair and Lincoln Steffens and Ida Tarbell and Jacob Reese and so forth.
These were journalists.
They were journalists, but they were watchdogs, important watchdogs, uncovering very bad things going on in government. You can even go back, Thomas Nast's cartoons, skewering Tammany bosses in the 19th century were an important form of watchdoggery, if you would.
But the idea of an in-house watchdog that we're paying for, taxpayers' money is paying for.
Yeah, that's actually new. Well, relatively new. We say that George Washington hired the first IG, Baron von Steuben, but he wasn't exposing corruption. He was just teaching the troops to do maneuvers better. Mm-hmm. So it was a kind of very different kind of IG. Yeah, the current notion, derived heavily from the IG Act in the early 1970s, is, I guess, relatively new.
One of the reasons that you said that you wrote the book is to encourage more young people, in fact, to become watchdogs.
I got to correct myself yet again. New York City's Department of Investigations has a long history.
Right, it's the largest in the country. And
has a long history. They were around at the turn of the last century, so in one form or another. Mm-hmm. So, back to your question, to encourage young people, yes, to encourage young people to go into the field, but to encourage young people and everybody else to resist the kind of cynicism and apathy that could destroy the fight against corruption. What I mean by that is there's a traditional cycle, a very valuable cycle, which is things get corrupt, somebody uncovers and exposes it, the public gets outraged, and that creates the political pressure for reform. Now, if that outrage response is replaced by cynicism, oh, they're all corrupt, what's the difference, what's the point? That means you don't get the political pressure for reform. Mm-hmm. So those people who have this knee-jerk cynicism and preach it are as important enemies of the public interest as those who actually practice corruption.
Are you seeing more of that today?
I'm afraid so.
Why?
Well, maybe because the 24-hour news cycle kicks up so many instances, maybe not more than there used to be, but it's reported so much more, that people are barraged with this constant drumbeat of he's corrupt, there's so much reported that perhaps people are getting the impression that everybody's corrupt, which of course is not true. Mm-hmm. But for whatever reason,
I thought it was.
Well, it's clearly not, and it's damaging to preach that, because it reduces the support for those who are not corrupt, and it reduces the pressure to change the factors that create corruption.
So how do you teach at John Jay? How do you teach IG work, oversight work, professional oversight?
Well,
what do students need to know and to do in order to make it a career?
I guess there are two. For purposes of answering this question, I divided into two segments: things that have changed and things that haven't changed. First, let me talk a little bit about things that have changed. Some of the techniques we use now are new or different than what I used when I was starting out. Because, for example, with the enormous expansion of our computer capacity, we no longer simply have to we no longer are limited to taking a small sample of a database to see if there's a pattern. We can, with computer assistance, we can look at the whole database, which is much better. So our students, much better than I can use this new technology for these purposes. That's just one little example of how technology has changed the field to some extent. But some things haven't changed. And so, for example, I give my students fact patterns that are based on actual situations. and say, what happened here? Explain this. Is there corruption here? How? How is it working? And it's not, that's inductive. I mean, you do enough things like that, you get the hang of it.
You would think their classes would be completely overcrowded because every youth have, kids have this fire in their belly. They have a sense of moral outrage, which as adults, the older you get, you don't, you're more accepting.
Well, the truth is we have a pretty big program. It's the biggest in the country. And the oversight and investigation track in our MPA program is enormous. We have about 800 students. So
wow.
It is a pretty big program.
And who are the types of kids you get in?
Most of them are local people, although we have people from all over the world, and we have an online program. So I've had classes in which in one class I had students who were physically located in Africa, the Ukraine, Hawaii, and I think Ireland. So so we do get people from all over the world, but most of our students are from our area.
Are there some alumni who've uncovered some fantastic things? Can you point to them?
I know there are. I think our next guest may be able to answer that better than I can because he's in touch with them once, he stays in touch once they become IGs. Phil.
Let me ask a sort of last question. I mean, is corruption always bad? I mean, a lot of countries,
there's a great
corruption
scholar.
is what makes the government and society go around.
There was a very prominent scholar, Samuel Huntington, who argued that corruption can be useful.
Yes.
Some people find his work persuasive. Another younger, more current leading scholar in the field named Susan Rose Ackerman at Yale argues to the contrary, and I'm of the Ackerman school. I think it is rarely useful, if ever. She counters a lot of Huntington's arguments, and I think she wins the fight.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Sure.
In a world where wrongdoing can be concealed by highly sophisticated technology, the art of the watchdog is getting harder. Phil Zisman spends a lot of time trying to help budding watchdogs. Let's call them watch puppies. He helps them master the skills and knowledge they need to cope with the new world. As executive director of the National Association of Inspectors General, he's also involved in setting guidelines and standards of conduct. Phil also teaches at John Jay, and he joins us today to help us explore what the future holds. Phil, welcome to the program.
Let's talk about some of the actual investigations that both of you have been involved in. What was the most interesting one and the most serious one that you were involved in?
Well, I did an investigation into corruption at the public schools in Yonkers, which led to the indictment of the superintendent of schools, the third largest city in the state, and also the finance commissioner. And ultimately, the cover-up was worse than the crime. They ended up lying under oath, and then they were prosecuted for perjury.
Dan, what was the most interesting one you did?
Well, I say your first is always your most memorable. The summer food program investigation of '76 was amazing. It was
summer food
program. It was supposed to feed hungry children. 85% of the money was going into the pockets of crooks, which is astonishing. I mean, if 20% of the program is waste, corruption, mismanagement, it's a lot. This one was unbelievable. Almost everything was being stolen. And our investigation there led to the criminal conviction of 17 people, including a sitting member of Congress. That was a big one. And even more important, and I think I'm proudest of this, it led to the cleanup of that program to the point that years later, other politicians figure, the Holtzman's investigation, I was working for Liz Holtzman at the time, Holtzman's investigation got her so much press, let me investigate it and see what I can find, and they couldn't find anything to expose because we really cleaned it up.
So we talked a moment ago about the danger of apathy, that people just get so used to hearing about corruption that eventually they just sort of turn off. How do you combat that? I mean, is it a real danger? I mean, are we losing sort of the cutting edge sense that we need to investigate things that are going wrong, and we just, instead of just being apathetic and passive?
Well, sure. I mean, one of the most important parts of government and the contract with the people is that the people trust the government. And if the people do not trust the government and think, oh, they're all corrupt, and they sit back, then there's no real check on what the government does. So the watchdog's goal, one of its most important objectives, is to basically to restore the public trust. So after there's a scandal, public confidence in government it's at its lowest ebb, And you need to basically clean the slate. You need to say, okay, here's what happened. Here's what we're going to do to correct it. And going forward, it will be better. If the public doesn't express their outrage and basically demand change, then there's really not a strong enough opportunity for change to occur.
It would be nice to think that after so many generations of uncovering fraud, abuse, corruption in government, that the people in power get the idea, and we won't see very much, but it's still, in fact, it seems to be, correct me if I'm wrong, increasing. We hear more of it, we hear more scandals. We have the Bridgegate scandal just most recently in New Jersey and the Port Authority. It seems to keep happening. It's a human, obviously, function, but why? I mean, what accounts for?
Well, I've thought a lot about that, and ultimately I have a theory. My theory, there's two types of people attracted to government. The people who really want to make government work and public service. Then there's the people who are attracted because of self-service, and they're interested they have ulterior motives. And of course there is the theory that once in power, the power corrupts. So the people who don't have a strong social conscience, don't really want to be there for the right reasons, the power themselves becomes very tempting. So to answer your question, why do we repeat this cycle of corruption over and over? It's because the power corrupts and people are not committed specifically to clean, open, honest government.
Are we worse or better than other countries?
Oh, there are actual measures of this. There's I forget the name of the organization that does statistical measures, and we're we're better than most. We're
Transparency International.
Yeah, I think we ranked 23rd, 26th, something like that, out of 150, 180, whatever the number is. We're closer to the top than the bottom for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a good thing, because in my view, there are societies that have been brought down entirely by the prevalence of corruption. I don't think most people have seen this, but one analysis of the decline of the Soviet Union, a pretty persuasive one, is that there was so much corruption that the impact on consumers was so bad, with half the product walking off in people's pockets instead of being sold and even reported to the government, that was a major contributor to the huge dissatisfaction that ultimately brought down that regime.
But people also assume in the Soviet Union at the time, I lived there at the time, that it was the way you had to get things done. Whether you were talking with a patrolman or a policeman on the street or trying to get a government contract.
Well, that's the fallacy of composition. It might be good for the individual, but its impact overall was made things so much worse for consumers that it was a contributor to the horrible dissatisfaction, which was justified.
But here's an issue that strikes me as well, thinking about corruption, that there's economic corruption, things that you do just to get money, to get rich, and there's also moral corruption. There's things that you do that either you're peddling influence. I mean, is one worse than the other? Is one harder to find out than the other?
Well, I mean, I think what is the symptom? I mean, in my mind, you raised this question about, can we actually teach morality to our elected officials or our appointed officials so that they basically do their job in the public interest as opposed to their own self-interest? And I think ultimately the answer is yes. I'm optimistic about that. If you develop a culture where that's expected, and if you have a mechanism of oversight which will basically verify that indeed that is what's happening. So I think we have to hold our officials accountable to it. The problem is, if you live in a municipality or in a city or state which doesn't have strong oversight, you still have the backdoor deals that are going to happen over and over. It's only when, with public participation and a commitment by the people who are actually working in government to combat those types of backdoor deals, will you prevent it and actually have clean government. So I think you can achieve it, but there has to be a commitment to it, and you have to be forever on your guard to try to ensure that the public officials are working in the public interest.
But are there different techniques? In other words, if you're talking about a moral failing, we're not talking about the Spitzer story about consorting with a prostitute or peddling abuse, rather than just making money out of your public service job. Is one harder to root out than the other? Is one worthy of more attention than the other? Or can you make those sorts of value judgments?
I'm not sure I know the answer, but I do know that when the public hears the message, as they did in the early 1980s, that government is not the solution, government is the problem, then who's going to go into government? Not the people that Phil was talking about who are devoted to the public interest, the people who want something else. A much better message was, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And if we do have an increase in corruption, I attribute it in part to that highly destructive message from the early 1980s.
Which is still out there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I read a story, just to bring it a little bit closer to home recently, that in New Jersey, something like 13 or 14 mayors have lost their jobs or been prosecuted because of corruption scandals. And that brings us, of course, to the whole Bridgegate issue. Mm-hmm. And I think we were talking a little bit earlier about how the IG, the Inspector General in New Jersey, is no more.
Well, the IG was eliminated when Governor Christie first came into office. And it was basically eliminated on the theory of it was a redundancy, that it was expensive and that there was an auditor that was in place that would take over these functions. And of course, Christie was riding a wave of popularity when he was in his first term, and he was able to marshal that repeal of the legislation through the legislature.
So are you guys horrified by what happened at Bridgegate, or do we know enough yet to, is this something that fits within your
well, the facts
you've done before?
Well, clearly the facts as we know them, as we know them, what has been established so far is obviously inappropriate and somewhat horrifying. We don't know what else we'll find out.
I mean, with respect to Watchdogs and the IG, though, it left a void. So you now have competing investigations, one by the legislature, one by the Port Authority IG. But one of the roles of an IG, actually, who we pay for, which you discussed earlier, is that they should be the final arbiter. They should find out what the facts are, issue a report, and that should basically decide an issue. In New Jersey, the state IG doesn't exist anymore, so now you'll have competing reports, and we don't know what the outcome will be.
You guys have both been doing this for a long time, and you're teaching students now how to do it. Are you more cynical now than you were when you started out?
I'm not. I think the students are terrific, and they hold enormous promise for the future.
And I think they will step up. I think that, you know, you do your part, and then you pass the torch. Everyone is replaceable. I think that our students, I think that there is a wave. As the executive director of the Association of Inspectors General, there's tremendous growth in our organization. People want to be involved. I think people, frankly, are sick of the corruption, sick of the abuse, the waste, and they want to be part of the solution. So I'm optimistic.
Thanks to both of you.
Thank you.
Abuses of power will always be around, as long as our affairs are run by fallible human beings. Most of us are too willing to look the other way, or throw up our hands. That's politics, after all, until a watchdog barks. But the special group of men and women who act as their eyes on government can't do the job alone. They need us as much as we need them. What does that mean? Here's a slogan to think about, borrowed from another context. If you see something, say something. I'm Steve Handelman. Thanks for watching. See you next month.